Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. We apologize for the bit of the off week here. We're going to be a few days late here on this episode here in the middle of March 2023, but we're here with you anyway. It's not like we didn't give you some content. We put out episode 2 of Ether Hour talking about the uncanonized czars, so be sure to check that out. That'll be at the link in the description here on Substack or on YouTube. But got a big week here. Like I said, we covered that stuff. We've got some more big stuff coming on the Substack as well. But Dimitri, how are you?
Doing great, Conrad. Lots of fresh, some sad, but some other really exciting news from around the world from the last week and a half or so. Definitely a lot to discuss, and frankly, we've just appreciated all the feedback we've received from some of the new Aether Hour episodes, the premium episodes on our Substack for subscribers, which we've released, and some of the ideas we have scheduled. I think you guys will really enjoy it. So feel free to try out the trial on the Substack. Check out some of the premium content. I think if you do appreciate the weekly episodes of World War Now, these will, also possibly interest you, especially some of the juicy information you receive. It's really unlike anything else on the internet, at least in audio form, so definitely check it out. But definitely a lot of subjects today, from basically all around the globe, definitely getting very multipolar and geopolitical today.
Yeah, no, we're going from the Caucasus to, crazy stuff going on in America to obviously stuff going on in Ukraine and Iran, China. So it's big things going on. Obviously, we have the extra weekend to prepare, so there's even more news. But with all that being said, I think we're going to dive into what's going on in the little nation that could of Georgia, where there's what appeared to be a full-blown attempt at another color revolution response to what was an anti-foreign agent law put forward by the Parliament of Georgia, which is the Georgian Dream Party, which, while not necessarily being a pro-Western party explicitly, they're very much not a pro-Russian party. They're really just a Georgian independence nationalist party that makes it very explicit that they try their best to be independent, but are ultimately mostly influenced by the EU and the US. But we saw the capital Tbilisi descend into chaos and protests, all for a bill that would just require organizations that receive over 20% of their funding from overseas to register as foreign agents. A lot of countries have these laws. So, Dimitri, what are your thoughts on this development?
Well, I think it's, if anything, that the events that occurred between the 6th of March and the 10th of March 2023 are actually a case study in how color revolutions are prepared and what happens when they actually don't achieve their goals explicitly, but implicitly they do instill this level of fear, at least in the politicians of a given nation, informing them that, hey, if you guys do not toe the line of the liberal democratic hegemony, reigning in the world. This includes the EU, the US, and other, large foreign bodies around the planet. We can call them the globalists, if you may. But if you do not toe that line, Georgia, or the Georgian Parliament, we will cause a color revolution in your country, and there's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, the entire mass media machine of the West will also side with the revolutionaries, and they will overthrow your democratically elected government. I have to say that without sarcasm, and your country will be taken over, essentially. And frankly, the law that they were trying to push through the Georgian Parliament wasn't even that controversial. It was simply that the bill was simply named Law on Transparency of Foreign Influence, and it mainly affected non-governmental organizations, or so-called NGOs, which are involved in Georgia. Now, a lot of these NGOs are, of course, funded from abroad, from overseas, American universities, university grants, organizations, some of them related to big characters such as George Soros. We know he was quite active in sponsoring a lot of these movements in Ukraine itself, which unexaggerate, this isn't an exaggeration, but these movements were part of the reason why the Maidan was so effective in 2014, because they were installed in Ukraine since the early 90s. But such movements were active in Georgia as well since the 90s as well, since the fall of the Soviet Union. And finally, the Georgian parliament said, hey, maybe we should kind of push out against some of these foreign influences, especially from Western nations, as well as this law also would apply to, say, foreign influence from the Russian Federation, for example, against the possible FSB funding or even SBU funding. Or the bill is very general. It's not a pro-Russian bill, so to speak. In fact, it mirrors the exact bill that, say, the United States has adopted many decades ago, as well as Russia in 2022, when the special military operation began. The Russian Federation instituted the law against foreign agents, which outlawed some pretty well-known organizations in Russia. I'll just name three. There was two radio stations named Rain TV, Dozh, and Medusa TV, which was Medusa TV was also a bit less popular but very liberal, and essentially these laws targeted these radio stations, completely outlawing them because these stations were receiving explicit foreign funding from the United States from various large universities and other, more covert sites, possibly linked to agencies such as the CIA. There's no real evidence to that, but I'm sure the Russians had something on them, which is why they shut them down in the first place. And of course, the third largest organization this law shut down in Russia was the Anti-Corruption Fund of Alexei Navalny, who is now, of course, imprisoned for all kinds of commercial machinations. But his primary organization, the Anti-Corruption Fund, was completely disbanded and made illegal. Actually, named a foreign agency and completely made illegal. So it seems that Georgian liberals and those associated with these NGOs have also suspected that this law may somehow attack their revenue streams, and kind of change their ways of operation in Georgia. And of course, what kind of influence do these NGOs bring? Well, as me and Conrad believe, it's probably none of it is probably Christian, none of it is positive, and none of these influences would enrich the Georgian nation's already strong cultural heritage. Of course, these things are from abroad and they bring around foreign, very alien ideas to the Georgian people.
And of course, the classic display of a color revolution, English language signs, Ukrainian flags, EU flags, in a country that has extremely low foreign language speaking proficiency. A lot of Georgians only speak Georgian, and and again, it's just the Georgian language only really exists in Georgia. If you're going to convince domestic Georgians, you need to make the signs in Georgian. But that's not who it's for. It's to convince the public and in other countries to manufacture consent for just a total stamping on the will of the people of this Orthodox country. And just a big similarity, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but Dimitri said they didn't have to go full color revolution because they're in Georgia. The president is already a U.S. puppet, and the parliament is only against the U.S. insofar as they are a better reflection of the actual Georgian people, because one party does have a supermajority and those people are locally elected. But even they still are very, very reticent to step out of line from the U.S. playbook. Even the prime minister, who's the person that was pushing forward the law to begin with, he had to come out after all these Georgians were outraged at the U.S.'s blatant interference. He had to say some of the comments from our allies were misconstrued and were confusing to the people, when the U.S. was openly saying that they would just start sanctioning Georgian politicians who supported this law, which is just absurd. So he had to walk back. Even though he didn't say anything, he had to basically walk back the Georgian people's outrage on their behalf to his U.S. overlords, which is just embarrassing. But the similarities to Ukraine continue in the sense that, so after Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, the pro-Russian president, was cooed out in the Maidan, he was replaced by Petro Poroshenko, who was a much more insane ultra-nationalist than even Zelensky, if you can, believe that these days. But much like Ukraine in that regard, Georgia, a few presidents back, had Mikhail Saakashvili, who was a total U.S. puppet, as well as an actual former politician in Ukraine. He was literally like a Ukrainian Georgian. But he's been like locked up in like a hospital and has all these weird videos of him like drunkenly like pooping and shitting himself. But it was this like, so he ultimately got voted out just like Poroshenko, because despite being like the ultimate kind of pro-EU, pro-Western candidate, he was so universally despised by like the people that they had to get him out, or else the West feared pro-Russians taking back over again, like what happened in Ukraine. They had to get to Zelensky, or else the pro-Russian party might have even been victorious had he not kind of run from the center. But there's one of the biggest NGOs that this affects, many of these being cultural NGOs like Tbilisi Pride, who are the people that put on the disgusting pride parade at the center of Tbilisi every year. In 2021, people will remember, especially if you had subscribed to my newsletter at the time, that in 2021, the Georgian church and many protesters completely disrupted the parade and stormed the offices of Tbilisi Pride itself and threw down the flags and tore it down. And I believe for months, like, they literally had to, like, people had to flee the country, and they were also effectively non-operational for at least a few months at some point. So it shows you that a united people in that regard can, do direct action and be effective there. But unfortunately, it seems that the law has been withdrawn, and the Georgian politicians are basically admitting that, yeah, we had to withdraw it for the interest of our nation, or else we would have descended into chaos, which is that should definitely be really reassuring to any Georgian patriots out there. But one of the things we saw was insane provocateurs and the more crazy people on the side of the Georgian anti-Russia operation that the Georgians need to invade South Ossetia and Abkhazia. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the level of provocation we saw on that end very heavily mimicked the rhetoric of Poroshenko when he was stating that the Crimea needs to be taken back, that, Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, all of these territories need to be Ukrainian again, that the protest in Odessa, in Kharkov need to be put down. This is in 2014 and 15 when the Maidan was still fresh, and the Ukrainian people were actually finding themselves. A lot of these Ukrainian pro-Russian people were in fact finding themselves actually very keen and eager to vote on perhaps on a more unionist position with Russia. I don't want to say separatist because Ukraine as a nation state is a separatist project from the great Russian civilization, but a more unionist position to unite themselves with Russia. And definitely those movements were shut down by Poroshenko, and Poroshenko began what would be this Western globalist reconquista of the Ukrainian lands, which Zelensky continues to this day. So definitely Poroshenko, an interesting character, worth reading about in your own time. And his sort of ethnic roots are also quite questionable. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but there are question marks there, especially about some of his staffers and people he was surrounded by. Definitely an interesting character, which Zelensky mimics as well and almost perfectly repeats in conduct. Now, another analogy I would find very interesting would be the protests in Belarus between 2020 and 21, where you saw, again, we all saw the formation of what would possibly be this color revolution. And of course, Lukashenko chose to shut it down in a very perhaps you could say violent, police heavy way. It's similar to how some protests were shut down in France, or even at the moment when France is shutting down protesters in a very sort of violent, explicit way. But Lukashenko really did put his foot down and said, no, we're not going to have this liberal Western influence, this Lithuanian, this Polish Lithuanian type of de-Belarusization of our land. This isn't going to happen. We're not going to invite all these weird unions into power. I'm not going to allow any democratic elections in Belarus to be overturned by these Western puppets. And so Lukashenko put his foot down, shut the protests down with force, which the Georgians did not. In fact, the Georgians, as Conrad just mentioned, the parliament actually seceded and rescinded the bill. They said, hey, okay, calm down, guys. No more protesting. We're going to rescind the bill. We're not going to pass it through Parliament. In fact, we're all going to unanimously vote against it in the next hearing, and that's it. It's going to get shut down. And of course, the president of Georgia returns to Georgia, and she's very happy that the country kind of stays on this Western status quo path. Now, naturally speaking, what everybody feared was that Georgia would, Maidan would occur, that the country would escalate into this Ukraine 2.0 in the Caucasus, and in fact, it would cause it would, of course, what would be the inspiration? The Western liberal nationalistic, and it's weird saying nationalistic and liberal in the same sentence, but that's exactly what we saw. This synthesis of this chimera of sorts occur in the Ukraine in the first place. Is Poroshenko essentially leading a liberal nationalistic reconquista of Ukraine into the Donbass and against Crimea? The same would occur in Russia, as Conrad mentioned. Southern Ossetia, Northern Ossetia, no, in fact, Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia on the coast of the Black Sea would in fact be perfect targets for the new Georgian reconquista and a sort of re-establishment of itself as a liberal Western future NATO republic. And unfortunately, we did not see that, but that's still on the cards. And you better believe it that NATO have this playbook. They have a whole have a whole folder full of strategies exactly on how to make this happen. Now, Abkhazia and Ossetia, I guess, to kind of describe these two lands, Abkhazia is right on the coast of the Black Sea on the eastern coast, and it touches the ancient lands of Kolchida, which Jason and the Argonauts traveled to in the ancient Greek days to find the to find the treasure and to fight dragons. So these lands go back way into the pre-Trojan war times in Greek mythology. Now, Abkhazia is naturally it's mostly populated by Abkhazians, who are a very distinct Caucasian people, very different from Georgians, in a way somewhat Georgian in their ancestry, but also somewhat distinct as well. Now, Abkhazians do see themselves as separate from Georgians, but also separate from Russians, and today unfortunately, since 2008, Abkhazians as well as South Ossetians have become these semi-member states of Russia in a way, similar to how Puerto Rico is under the protectorate of the United States. Abkhazia and South Ossetia are under this administrative protectorate of the Russian Federation. Now, Abkhazians are really, I guess, it's hard for me to describe the people in general, but it would be fair to say they are very culturally stuck up, and they kind of see themselves as separate from both Georgians and Russians. They wouldn't necessarily be eager to join Russia, as well as they would probably prefer to be this little Switzerland on the coast of the Black Sea with their this little Sochi, this little independent Israel, so to speak, of the Black Sea coast. Now, South Ossetians are more pro-Russian than even, I would say, even Dagestanis or maybe perhaps even Chechens at this point. South Ossetians, they even have this large Orthodox Christian population, and North Ossetia has been within the territory of Russia for many centuries now, at least two and a half centuries. So these people have lived alongside Orthodox Russians for a very long time, not as long as the Georgians, but they do appreciate Russian culture to the point where we saw many South Ossetians sign up as volunteers to fight in the special military operation early last year. And now South Ossetia is this territory which Georgians claim is still theirs, that Russia has taken control of, that Georgians need to retake. Ossetians, again, ethnically very similar to Georgians in that same Caucasian group. They're not ethnically Russian either, but they're very, very sympathetic towards Russia. And Georgians were also sympathetic towards Russia in the 200 years ago during the Russian Empire. Now, unfortunately, the Soviet history and the revolutions and the history of the 90s kind of broke these two Orthodox nations apart, but there was still this common ground which Ossetians have held on to. In fact, and we see this, Ossetians really do love Russians, and Ossetians are, you can say, South Ossetia is perhaps the Donbass, the Lugansk and the Donetsk of the Southern Caucasus, you can almost say that much, which means that if a Maidan would have occurred in Georgia, the first place they would have, of course, tried to retake would be South Ossetia, and Russians would have had to defend South Ossetia as they defended Donbass in February 2022. So that was the utmost kind of the implication of this entire protest. Now, the fact that it hasn't occurred only means that it has been postponed until later. If anything, the West isn't going to let go of Georgia. They're not going to allow Russian influence to infiltrate Georgia and to kind of bring it back to its Orthodox roots. That's never going to happen. So the Georgia is always going to be an ace up the sleeve of NATO as well as the EU powers that, continue to cause chaos around the world.
Yeah, so South Ossetia, there's a much better case for it to perhaps be reunified with North Ossetia, which is already part of Russia, of course, than there is for them to really push for Abkhazia to rejoin, especially as we've seen the Russian church has actually made it pretty clear that they're not really interested in supporting the idea of the Abkhazian Orthodox Church as like a separate entity from the Georgian Orthodox Church. And the local priests there have even like suspended services to quote unquote like force Patriarch Kirill's hand. And there's also apparently even a schismatic Abkhazian Orthodox Church that's ultimately under, of course, the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So no surprise there. We'll see. We could maybe see the EP get involved in the whole Georgia thing if those things start to kick off a bit more. We know that from our perspective, we view the global machinations as certain cover for even the ecclesial machinations. But, the EP will try to, the powers that be will try to get the EP, who they know are already on their side, involved to just muddy the waters and give those that seek to divide the church more of a pretense to schism and do horrible things. So pray for that doesn't happen. But yeah, Georgia, it's very fascinating. It's one of our favorite countries to analyze and look at. We love talking about St. Gabriel or Gabadze. And, one of the things in my initial World War III thread in my article, Georgia is one of those countries that will it be, if it makes the wrong choice, it will very much be a bad place to be, I think, during, the coming tribulations due to its proximity to Russia, the Black Sea, Turkey, and these places. But it is an Orthodox nation, and we have to hope that they could, I think they have the ability to achieve a more neutral status if they return to orthodoxy as their identity and not some kind of anti-Russian flank. And we know that the NATO powers want to start some kind of second front without pulling in other powers. It's a very difficult surgery they're trying to perform. And at this point, a lot of people, we have Georgia, we have Belarus, we discussed that. And there's also Kazakhstan, which people forget that it was in I believe it was that early 2022, Russia had to go in and really put down some stuff in Kazakhstan. But in general, Kazakhstan, the leadership has, while not necessarily embraced the West, they've definitely made moves to kind of dislocate themselves from direct Russian influence. But I think it's interesting. I want to get your thoughts on Kazakhstan, Dmitry. But you talked about Lukashenko and Belarus. Like, remember, like before the early 2022 coup against Belarus, which was openly, funded by the West and that it was very liberal as well. The Lukashenko was leaning more and more towards the West. Putin was trying to bring him back in, but Pompeo had gone to Belarus, promised Lukashenko oil at comparable competitive prices to the Russians, all this kind of stuff. And it seemed that Lukashenko was maybe willing to move that way. But ultimately, the whole COVID thing came, and Lukashenko became the worldwide anti COVID hero and rejected vaccines and masks and all that kind of nonsense, even better than Russia did. And that, of course, turned the ire of Zog against him. But when all that started, like once they realized that was going to go down, they hit the color revolution hard, tried to get him out. And Lukashenko quickly realized, all right, that little game I'm done playing, calling on Putin again, returning to, White Russia needs to know its place here in Greater Russia, and it's kind of been the story ever since. And that's like a domino effect that who knows that if that hadn't gone successfully, Russia might not have felt prepared to do the special military operation and to go into Ukraine. So we really, in many ways, the U.S. foreign policy kind of bungled that one themselves in a lot of ways by bungling and fumbling the Belarus bag. But Kazakhstan is another example. It's huge in many ways. A lot of Russian nationalists or somewhat irredentists would view northern parts of Russified Kazakhstan as something that should already be incorporated into Russia. But the Russians very obviously don't want to be reclaiming territory on multiple different fronts. That would be a very bad, at least in their eyes, the international community and like the optics war. That would be a bad look and be a much easier way to get a unified global force to actually go in and balkanize your country. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on what's going to happen there and what the machinations of the enemy will make happen on the second front issue.
Yeah, Kazakhstan, of course, is greatly still dependent on Russia, and it's similar to how Bitcoin is coupled and pegged to the US dollar, and in fact, as the US dollar moves in a certain way, so does Bitcoin, and all the other altcoins, they move alongside Bitcoin. They're all interrelated, and they're not disconnected. So is Kazakhstan attached to Russia in such an intimate way, perhaps, that many may not realize. I was listening to an interview of a prominent Kazakh economist, and he was saying that since the beginning of the SMO, McDonald's has completely shut down operations in Kazakhstan. Now, why is that? Well, is it because Kazakhs lack meat? Perhaps they can't make their burger patties or the meat for their Big Macs. But no, in fact, it's true. They actually do not have the industry. They do not have factories to make meat for their burgers. And in fact, so McDonald's had to completely shut down their operations because imports from Russia have stopped coming to Kazakhstan completely. And so Kazakhstan is really still finding itself in terms of in this new liberal independent democratic world order as they're still kind of very split. Its people are very divided. There's a lot of failed projects. For example, the purchasing of Australian Angus cattle to make Angus beef and burgers. In fact, even though beef really isn't a staple of the Kazakh diet, so they purchased hundreds and thousands of these cows, and these cows are not being eaten at all. There's no demand for them. Meanwhile, the average Kazakh person really loves to eat chicken, but they haven't purchased enough chicken to raise on farms. So the entire country's economy is very chaotic, and it's very much interrelated with Russia. Imports and exports are affected to the point where even large corporations like McDonald's really cannot operate in Kazakhstan, even though McDonald's hasn't sanctioned Kazakhstan at all, but it just cannot operate there because of its relationship to Russia. Now, more on a more serious note, Kazakh politics are very much almost caste-based, to the point where there are three main castes, and they're geographically located. So the northern Kazakhstan is normally considered where the elites come from. So northern Kazakhs are the sort of Brahmin of the Kazakh society, whereas the southern Kazakhs are considered almost like the underclass, and the central Kazakhs are somewhat of the middle class. A very kind of aesthetically outlined pyramid of Kazakh politics there. Now, the two Kazakhstan capitals as well have an interesting history, because Kazakhification, just as Ukrainization occurred in Ukraine during the Soviet Union, so did Kazakhification occurred in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan the people of Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs, in themselves being nomadic throughout their entire thousand-year-old history since probably the times of Genghis Khan, have never built cities, which was why there are no ruins, there are no ancient Kazakh capitals, because they always moved around in tent cities. So they never really established themselves on any sort of geographical landscape. The Russians were the first to build one major fortress or city called Verny, which means loyal. Now, Verny was in the center, in the southern center of Kazakhstan, and this was the furthest most outpost of the Russian Empire in the Kazakh lands. Now, notice how Verny and Grozny sound very similar. It's because these are two sister cities. Verny was the fortress of the Russian Tsars in Kazakhstan, while Grozny was the fortress of the Russian Tsars in the Caucasus Mountains. Now, of course, the capital of Chechnya, Grozny. Now, Verny was renamed to Almaty in the 90s, which Almaty, it's a bit weird. I'm not even sure what that name means necessarily. It's kind of like a made-up Kazakh word. No offense to Kazakh people, but they try to Kazakhify their own nation in a way, kind of making you similar to how Ukrainians change the names of many of their cities. So the nation of Kazakhstan very much is still finding itself, hence their middle ground between countries such as Russia, China, the US, inviting businesses, inviting corporations from different superpowers around the world, because they're still trying to, in one way, they're trying to disconnect themselves from Russia. On the other hand, as even the prominent Kazakh economists say, they really cannot disconnect themselves from Russia. They are attached via an umbilical cord. Their economy will completely crash if anything happens to Russia, or if Russia even chooses to sanction them. So, and maybe this is a good thing in a way, because Russia can depend on Kazakhstan as a certain loyal output, as an outpost of loyalists, or those who will not turn against Russia because of their interdependence. It's so closely tied, and the relationship is similar to that of Belarus and Russia, which Belarus is much more friendly on a cultural level. Kazakhs are still trying to assert their independence over Russians. Now, of course, the Kazakh revolution, which almost happened in recently, was put down by Russian peacekeeping forces, sending in to assist the Kazakh police. But it does show that the Kazakh ruling class really does not have that sort of a strong grasp, especially over the young population. The Kazakh population is very young in general. I think the average median age is under 30. So there's a lot of young, disenfranchised, jobless, workless, almost without any career prospects, young Kazakh people, men especially, who are very keen on making themselves a career, and they want to make something of themselves in life. And the ruling class, of course, the elites, don't want to give them any opportunities. So there is a high chance of course, a possible color revolution in Kazakhstan in the future. That's why Russians are keeping a very keen eye on that particular area, on that landscape. And frankly, as I agree with you, Conrad, we won't see a reconquest of Kazakhstan, so to speak, but we may see future peacekeeping operations into the region. Russians need to very delicately handle it, because you don't want to anger the locals, especially anger the various different castes and tribes which exist there. It's more about kind of organically bringing Kazakhstan under Russian influence, slowly, first through soft power and then through hard power, as Kazakhstani politics are reduced to their sort of natural state, which is complete chaos. That's why the land was never united, and even now it's very, very much a disunited landscape. I think that's kind of the outlook on Kazakhstan, which is different from Belarus, which the Belarusian people, especially those around Minsk, have always been united in their Russian Orthodox identity, and they've always seen themselves as different from their Lithuanian, Polish allies, not allies, enemies next door.
Kazakhstan is an interesting place. If you remember, the Russia had to go in there as a CSTO operation, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is kind of a remnant. That's kind of the ex-Soviet Union states version of NATO, which I think before the special military operation, Russia was kind of trying to maintain its relevance, and that was a lot of the point of the quick in and out Kazakhstan operation, which was quite successful, combined with what the Kazakhstan color revolution attempt was like the least aesthetic color revolution attempt ever. So total failure on the people that were doing it. But I think that attempt at reviving the CSTO kind of went by the wayside. Now that we've seen the whole Armenia-Azerbaijan thing kind of just collapse into inanity, it seems that Russia is going to focus on its own priorities militarily and only focus on, the CSTO when it directly involves the current fighting operation in the current situation. And when it comes to Kazakhstan and the cities, Astana, which has been changed a half dozen times, the name at least, is like the most Masonic city ever. I think I may write an article about this, and I promise you there's more articles coming. I keep saying I'll write articles. I've got like half of them drafted. I promise you they're coming. We're getting things settled here, and now that we've got your support with the paid Substack, it's going to be even easier. But Astana, if you go, especially all the government buildings, the major corporations, there's just an overabundance of cubes surrounded by six-pointed stars, surrounded by squares and compasses and weird golden globes and astral signs all around this place. And this city was like built up on purpose as a capital, much in the way of like Brasilia or some of these other cities that really built up a capital city for the purpose of bringing in a political class so as to not have too much local influence of a specific city, which is an interesting political idea in and of itself. But I think it's interesting to watch, especially as Kazakhstan is going to be a viewed southern flank by both the enemies and those strategizing within Russia. It's important to recognize that there's clearly some overt occult influence, as well as, of course, from my perspective, Kazakhstan was the space cap was where all the space launches, quote unquote, supposedly were within Russia. So and all that. So we'll be watching closely. It's a very big. People forget this is the fifth largest country by area in the world. So
That's right, and Kazakhstan's strategic location, of course, aligned geographically with between China and Russia, given that, and it's the second largest nation in the world in terms of uranium deposits. So uranium, of course, used for both nuclear reactors, which is probably the power source of the future, as well as the great nuclear weapons everybody keeps talking about, especially in geopolitics and foreign policy. Very key strategic area, and Russia will not be letting Kazakhstan go under Western influence. And if anything, if Kazakhstan does fall into chaos, I do see Russia moving its full force into Kazakhstan in order to at least keep peace, similar to how you could say, and not in a negative sense, but similar to how the US entered into Afghanistan to keep the poppy seed fields occupied, for obviously for reasons of CIA projects and with a nefarious purpose. But the US's goals in Afghanistan, even if they were negative, the Russia will do the same in Kazakhstan for purposes of securing natural resources and keeping the land in somewhat of a stable condition, because that's essentially what I think the goals of the world powers will be. They know Kazakhstan is weak, its military is really incompetent, it doesn't have any future large prospects, essentially, but it does have an incredibly rich, nomadic, very distinct culture, as well as some of the resources. They're really unmatched anywhere in the world. Even Siberia, in many ways, could equate to some of the resources Kazakhstan has, and Kazakhstan in many ways does kind of naturally flow into Siberia. So all this land is very much united and related. Russia is very interested in Kazakhstan as well as the world powers, as Conrad just mentioned.
and they have one of the hardest flags in the game. Not going to deny it. Their flag is extremely aesthetic. So with all of that, I mean, we're in Kazakhstan. Maybe going south a little bit to Iran. We had some big news this week where China brokered the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who have been, kind of the two major warring powers in the Muslim world since, I don't know anyone, the post 9/11 world. That's kind of been at the latest. That's been the game there, and we see them clashing in Yemen with Iran obviously being the main funder of the Houthi rebels there. Saudi Arabia, of course, has generally been more supportive of Israel than all and haven't been involved in funding the Muslim opposition there that Iran does, like in Palestine and Lebanon and those areas. And so this is big. And of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia also being two of the biggest oil producing powers in the world, and China buying from both of them now exclusively in yuan and directly challenging the petrodollar. This is a big deal. And the US is definitely running damage control. We see Blinken running off to Africa to try to have more influence there because he knows, Russia's there too, militarily speaking, not on paper, but, through Wagner PMC. And as China seems to be stepping directly into the global mediation world with a high profile case like this, obviously we don't expect any Nobel Peace Prizes for Wang Yi, even if he may deserve one. But in spirit, they're challenging the US in that regard. And Saudi Arabia seems willing to be actual diplomats and not maintain their vassal status, even though I give MBS Mohammed bin Salman some credit because in his defense, like they know that they'd get stomped in a direct war with Iran, so you kind of stick with the U.S. there. But it seems that he recognizes that the U.S. and Zog are a bigger civilizational threat than even perhaps certain military clashes with their Muslim neighbor. So I think this really can't be understated how big of a deal this is, especially on the economic side, as the U.S. experiences some of the largest bank crashes since 2008, and even in their history, which we're also going to be watching closely on the economic side. But China and Russia, of course, coming closer together only is going to be easier now that China is really, I mean, China and Russia almost compete for how much they can support Iran in the face of world sanctions, which I think is very funny, which proves how valuable Iran is and how that there are trump cards and natural geographical resources and cultural bastions that one can maintain to truly survive against like the full onslaught of the globalist empire.
That's right, and we see the president of China, Xi Jinping, meeting in person with the Iranian president. Of course, we mentioned this on the previous episodes, greeting him personally, leading him into his personal cabinet to have a word, through translations and things, really getting to know him. So China moving closer in the same month with both Iran as well as Russia. Xi Jinping, of course, scheduling a meeting with President Zelensky in order to discuss, I suppose, what would be some sort of peace agreements between him and Russia, and Xi Jinping also visiting Moscow next week. So in the span of 1.5 months, we see Xi Jinping essentially spreading his influence throughout the world, personally getting involved, not just sending his foreign minister, but he himself as the president of the Chinese people, this billion person new sort of new Chinese empire, kind of really getting involved. And what's interesting is that we saw the same from Erdogan in early 2022 when he was trying to spread Turkish influence to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and in fact not achieving anything. None of the peace talks really got anywhere in Turkey. The prisoner exchanges were very limited. Nobody respected Erdogan as much, neither from Kiev nor from Moscow. But here we have Xi Jinping essentially taking the same role as this kind of middleman peacekeeper. And naturally, we spoke about on previous episodes Xi Jinping's or China's, I guess China as a whole, its influence on the Ukrainian-Russian conflict and its interests. What can China get out of this? Could it be exports of weaponry and technology to Russia? Could it be exports of drones, humanitarian aid perhaps to both Russia and Ukraine? There are benefits which China can gain, and of course China probably looks out for itself first, as opposed to actually caring about the civilizational state of the Russian-Ukrainian relations, or maybe some of the religious background issues, or even possibly who the Donbass belongs to. So China perhaps thinks very slowly and very civilizationally, hence Xi Jinping, we see him almost pre-planning all of these great moves that he's making, and it'll be very interesting to see exactly what he achieves. My prediction and my prognosis is most likely Russia is so deeply committed in the Ukraine that there's nothing China can propose and can offer to Russia at this moment, especially when Russia has already given up so much in this trade with China. For example, Russia sells Siberian gas to China at a very discounted rate already. So when I see on Twitter sometimes that Chinese spokespersons, they say, well, if Russia discounts its gas even more to China, perhaps China could provide Russia with more weapons and equipment. I don't think that's possible. Russia already discounts its gas by almost 40%. All of its gas exports are incredibly cheap from Siberia to China. So these things must be considered. Russia also needs to get something out of this relationship. And I just don't see Xi Jinping offering anything significant to Putin, even any sort of perks on the Security Council in order to warrant a sort of premature peace agreement. But then again, Putin might also have these influences around him who want a peace agreement to take place in order for Russian assets abroad to be unfrozen and for them to be returned back into the bank accounts of the Russian politicians and oligarchs. Because remember, Conrad, that's one of the things Putin did mention, that the amount of assets seized by Western powers and Western banks and Western special forces from funds held by Russians in overseas banks and overseas investment funds equated to almost as much as the overall aid that was provided to Ukraine over the last year, which would be around $150 billion in US currency. So again, Xi Jinping most likely is just reaching out a hand, showing his diplomatic skill, but I'm not necessarily, I don't think he will achieve anything, and I don't think he'll offer anything to Zelensky that Zelensky will take. Because remember, Zelensky's spoken to many world leaders at this point, notwithstanding not Xi Jinping personally, and nobody has really offered Zelensky anything more than, say, weapons. Zelensky doesn't need much more. He just wants land, wants weapons, he wants Ukrainian supremacy over the landscape.
And regarding China's, shift towards Russia and against the West in this regard, they just appointed a new defense minister, who's the General Li Shangfu, who is literally under U.S. sanctions already, which I think is just a very explicit move, so showing that, yeah, from a defense perspective, from the perspective of our military, we're not taking into account our quote unquote, relationship with the U.S. or our trade relationships with the U.S. What's important is this broader shift against unipolarity here, and that's what we're that's what we're going to be doing. And I think as Xi actually goes to Russia, and as he actually assumes his third term, his third 5-year term as president of China, which is unprecedented, honestly, so far, he has really cemented his power within the Chinese Communist Party, the CPC. So we now see, in a way, I almost wonder if, again, I've said this before, China isn't necessarily a natural ally of Russia. The Sino-Soviet split really damaged relations, and there's just a lot of territorial disputes in the East that either country are both like very, they recognize as important. So that's always going to be a point of tension there. But Xi himself is, he's very intellectual. I think he himself has a civilizational perspective, and he's been to these other countries, and he knows that he fundamentally understands that the leadership in the West have no respect for their own traditions and their own culture. He knows them better than them. He's quite a read person. He speaks many different languages, and I think now he realized, and I think the move of China to Russia might be a product of the Jinpingization of the Communist Party of China, and that I think that's a good thing, in the sense that that means that Chinese society and the government are more united around a civilizational perspective, as opposed to either a more technological New World Order perspective, which is still always a danger from China, or a revanchist society that wants to even fight Russia as its perceived ethnic or religious adversary due to other historical grievances. So I think, generally speaking, it's a positive development there.
And one more quick fact, just before we move away from Asia and Central Asia, is that the current president of Kazakhstan, Kasim Takayev, actually speaks fluent Mandarin. So whenever he communicates with Xi Jinping, it has been noticed that, unlike the previous Kazakhstan president, he speaks in fluent Chinese. And this is a relationship that no other real I guess foreign leader really has with Xi Jinping. So again, the relationship between Kazakhstan and China is also instrumental, and the President Takayev's personal relationship with Xi Jinping is incredibly interesting to watch. Again, as Kazakhstan attempts to disassociate itself away from Russia and kind of find new allies in the world. One of them, of course, may be China. The other one being the United States, naturally. Now, further developments in, of course, the Asian Middle Eastern region are of course, coming from Turkey, which names an official opposition leader, Kilik Daroglu, as a joint challenger to Erdogan, as BBC.com news reports. Now, Kilik Daroglu is this elderly Kemalist left-wing, you can say center-left oppositionary leader, who is supposed to actually present himself against Erdogan in June of 2023 in the upcoming Turkish elections. Kilik Daroglu, what's interesting about him is that he not only does he meet the criteria for this Turkish sort of, as David described, this Turkish drive for sovereignty and national identity, but he also adheres to the principles provided by NATO and by these Western forces. So he is a bit more liberal than, say, Erdogan is. And in fact, there is that risk, which we spoke about with David Erhan on our Turkish stream, which everyone should check out, that this next oppositionary leader, at this point we didn't know was Kilik Daroglu, but now we do know, Kemal Kilik Daroglu has this risk of actually pushing Turkey into this Western coalition against Russia in the Ukrainian conflict. Now, one of the greatest perks he has against his oppositionary opposition Erdogan is the fact that the earthquake, of course, has taken so many thousands of lives, and this he is already using actually on his first, I guess, inaugural speech as the leader of the opposition. He's already mentioning the fact that the horrendous earthquake, he doesn't blame it essentially in Erdogan, but he does say the failures of the previous administration do bring about these particular causes. He does say that we can actually build and strengthen Turkey in a better state. And so we do have this particular development in Turkey now. The implications are huge because on one hand, he's a weaker personality than Erdogan. Me and Conrad have praised Erdogan over the last few episodes as this really popular as well as powerful and effective politician. Kılıçdaroğlu, really a kind of a rundown, almost maybe a bit too old for politics character, possibly a backbencher of sorts on the Turkish parliament. Not really a suitable front figure in order to oppose Erdogan. But Erdogan may lose only on the basis of the fact that of the recent earthquake, as well as his failure to kind of reestablish himself as this as a leading person in Turkish foreign policy, especially in Syria and in Ukraine. Erdogan has taken a very neutral position, and in fact, I think a lot of Turkish nationalists are questioning why exactly Erdogan hasn't moved further into Syria, why Erdogan hasn't pushed Turkish influences on, say, the Balkans or even in Ukraine. Really, Erdogan has taken a very conservative stance, and this could be critiqued by his oppositionary leaders.
In our last episode, we talked about how Kılıçdaroğlu was picked as the candidate, but he was in a not very stable position. It was kind of the best case scenario for Erdogan, considering he was the least popular, as Dimitri said, least charismatic, this kind of backbencher candidate. He's the most left wing of the candidates that could have been put forward, and Turkey's not a particularly left wing society. He's the most Americanist, I guess you could say, of all of them, even though none of them are Americanists themselves, but he is the most in that direction. But what's changed this week was that right when he was initially announced, the Nationalist Opposition Party immediately dropped out and was like, no, we're not supporting him for the presidency. But in this past week, they've rejoined. He's completely re-strengthened this coalition. And even just talking to David about it, he seems surprised that this happened so quickly. So as far as I can tell, I think the powers that be and the NATO American bloc is really, really trying to get behind him and the opposition here to get Erdogan out in this upcoming election. And again, this is the kind of thing that really is going to push forward some of the prophecies that we've been talking about. Again, a lot of people would say they couldn't see how, Turkey could move more towards NATO or something like this could happen that could have a provocation like this. Yet here we are. Suddenly, Turkish politics has really changed to where something that people would not have assumed that Kılıçdaroğlu, of all people, would have a good chance of defeating Erdogan. But one harp-inspired earthquake and some NATO intervention later, and here we are. So I think people need to realize how quickly the times are changing. And while over a few months period, nothing may really happen, you may wake up one weekend and 6 years of history will happen before your very eyes. So I think, like I say, we live in very interesting times here. But we'll be watching the Turkish election closely, of course. We're probably going to have our first live stream on the World War Now YouTube channel in the next few weeks with David talking about the Turkish election. If not a little bit before the election itself, definitely actually live streaming the election itself, keeping up with the outcome, commenting on it, and the reaction and in the way that we know how, not just looking at global news and headlines, but at the more interesting kind of niche spiritual publications and corners of the internet. But with all of that, there are some very unfortunate things happening in Ukraine. As we all know, people are dying, the soldiers is always a tragedy, but even the persecution continues to get worse. We've said it before, it continues to ramp up, but now even the Kiev Cave, Pecher's Caves Monastery, even the lower monastery, which the canonical church had been given access to this time, they're now being evicted. Zelensky has come out with a full-throated condemnation of the canonical church about nonsense about being spiritually independent in Ukraine and everything. And there's been some news about what Strelkov was told by some monks about some of these places at Svyatogorsk, and it seems that as the Russian line continues to push forward and the diplomatic solutions actually kind of fade into the distance, according to Peskov at least, the spiritual battle continues to ramp up even more.
Yeah, it of course seems that Zelensky, he wasn't fulfilled enough by simply taking over the large cathedrals in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, simply throwing out those concerts, staging them, turning them into essentially museums similar to the Hagia Sophia at one point, kind of definitely desecrating these great holy sites of the Ukrainian Church and the Russian Orthodox Church in total, and the entire Orthodox Church, for that matter, one of the holiest places on earth, I'd say, and one of the bastions of the Theotokos, as the Orthodox tradition calls them. But the lower church, which also contains within itself some of the caves, the lower monastery of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, is also which where all the monks actually live, and all the quarters where all of the relics are of the saints. And we're talking about 70 to 75 relics of saints are being held in these caves. The Ukrainian Minister of Culture actually came out just a day ago on the 13th of March and mentioned very explicitly that these relics belong in a museum, and these relics are not being looked after by the pro-Russian clergymen of the Kiev-Pechersk monastery. So we see this sort of rhetoric come out now. It's very explicit, very disgusting, very hurtful and painful to hear to the Orthodox ear. But I guess to all Christians it's quite offensive, because relics are there to be venerated, not kept in museums under special containment conditions and protocols. Zelensky naturally openly has called the Russian church collaborators of the terrorist regime being Russia, and he has openly stated that, as Conrad said, the Ukrainian government will be as in literally expelling the Russian Orthodox Church of Ukraine out of the monastery by the end of March of 2023. So we are waiting for the reaction of of all the faithful in Ukraine. How will they, in particular, take these news? Will they allow their holiest site in the entirety of the Ukrainian lands to be desecrated, and for these relics to be possibly taken into museums, possibly moved, lost, taken for examination? Will they allow this to happen, or will they actually rise up and prevent the Ukrainian government from seizing these holy sites? Again, the pressure is on the Ukrainian people, not so much the Russians, who actually do not control Kiev at this point and really have no say. Patriarch Kirill did appeal to the United Nations, as well as all these other Orthodox jurisdictions around the world: Jerusalem, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, Greece, the American Orthodox Church, Antioch, Georgia, Serbia. He did appeal to everyone, asking them for assistance. Can anyone on our behalf speak to these Ukrainian demonic politicians, actually talk them out of this act? But no, it seems like Zelensky and his politicians have made up their mind, and they're going to take the Kiev caves, they're going to take the relics, and attack this once great and venerated holy site from the Orthodox Church. It's very apocalyptic, but it's not something we haven't seen before, especially during the communist persecutions.
And I just want to reiterate, we've talked about the prophecies of St. Lawrence of Chernigov before, but I just want to read his exact words. It's been a few episodes, and this is big. I mean, this is the gem of all of Ukraine. We have Sviatogorsk, which we're going to talk about in a sec, the Pearl of Donbass, but Kiev Pochaev, the Kiev Caves, these are the earliest hearts of the Russian Orthodox spirit, of the new Christian, of the third Rome, the second Christian Rome. These are key. And St. Lawrence, he said, when a little freedom appears, when the churches and monasteries are being opened and restored, then all false teaching will come out, and the demons and secret atheists (parentheses, Catholics, Uniates, Ukrainians, self-ordained, and others) will fiercely take up arms against the Orthodox Russian Church, its unity, and its conciliar nature. A godless authority will support these heretics, and therefore they will take churches away from the Orthodox and slaughter the faithful. Then the Metropolitan of Kiev, not worthy of the name, together with his like-minded hierarchs and priests, will strongly shake the Russian Church. The whole world will be amazed at his lawlessness and will be frightened. He himself will go off into eternal perdition like Judas. And I read this prophecy as being regarding the schismatics, even in many ways, possibly Zelensky himself. I think that could be kind of the world stage, what it's referencing, what we might be seeing in the future. And it would be following a constant pattern of U.S. proxies being turned on by their benefactors once their usefulness has dried up. But the bodies, this kind of stuff about relocating to museums and this kind of stuff, this is the kind of stuff that the Soviets would use as a pretext to then desecrate these places and have the secular goblins that inhabit the institutions that would enforce these laws, commit all sorts of blasphemies. But we've heard from Russians with Attitude has been talking about this. I believe it was in December of 22. There was murmurings of this, that Strelkov has come out talking. Igor Strelkov, the hero of the early Donbass revolutions, and now controversial Kremlin critic. He said some things about what some monks from Sviatogorsk told him about these persecutions and whatnot.
Yeah, so Strelkov passes on to us in the late 22 during an interview online on YouTube, actually, while he was still stationed in Moscow. He says that in 2014, he was approached by some elder monks during his stay at the Svyatogorsk monastery. This is after the Maidan, while he was the defense minister of Donetsk. So this was Strelkov's main role, I guess, during the defense of Donetsk against Poroshenko and his sort of encroachment upon the Donbass republics. And Strelkov was great friends of a lot of Svyatogorsk monks, and of course, perhaps at one point an elder approached him and told him of this prophecy that once a year, half a year, and this prophecy goes as such: half a year after the heretics take over the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra and the caves, 6 months will pass, and Russia will reunite with Ukraine as it was before, and Kiev would be liberated from not just the heretics but also all outside forces. And Strelkov passes this, I suppose, this oral, verbal prophecy of clairvoyance onto us through, I guess, this video interview, through a YouTube video. It's interesting, we spoke about the fact that prophecies, in many ways, Orthodox prophecies, aren't peer-reviewed, they aren't published in journals, they aren't necessarily given over to us Orthodox Christians in some sort of written form. And mostly it's usually verbal clairvoyant sayings of saints, such as we mentioned Elder Paisios' prophecies about Turkey were given to his disciples, as well as some of the novices and people visiting him as spiritual children. And the same thing here. So Strelkov no doubt had a priest confessor in the Svyatogorsk Lavra monastery, which is mainly to kind of emphasize, Svyatogorsk Lavra is the third largest monastery in Ukraine, and it's probably the fifth largest monastery in Ukraine and Russia combined. It's one of the biggest monasteries in all of Eastern Europe. It's very, very important. And it's located right on the border of Russia and sort of Russia, Ukraine, and Donbass. So right in that key area where a lot of fighting is going on. We know, unfortunately, news that over the last 8 years, many priests and monks have actually died from shellings in that area. It's very much in the heart of the fire and the fight at the moment. Now, more evidence that Strelkov has had close relations with Svyatogorsk Lavra is, of course, comes from his interview of one of the most notable priests in the Russian Orthodox Church, and the now deceased Father Vsevolod Chaplin. Father Vsevolod Chaplin interviewed Strelkov in 2018 in October. Most of you, those in the Orthodox Church, especially the Russian Orthodox Church, would remember Father Vsevolod as one of the more prominent spokespersons of the Moscow Patriarchate, especially as he was the head of the Synodal Department of Cooperation of Church and Society between 2009 and 2015. So he would appear on a lot of talk shows on Russian TVs. He would debate atheists. He would, critique feminists about abortion. He would speak. He had this very deep voice. He'd be very opinionated, and he would speak clearly about Orthodox conservatism and Orthodox ideas, morality, and ethics. Now, Father Vsevolod was fortunate enough to interview Strelkov, and they spoke very clearly about Russian civilization, the fight in the Donbass, about orthodoxy in those regions. And Strelkov told him that a lot of his personal Strelkov's bodyguards, while he was the Minister of Defense of Donetsk, were actually former novices or veterans who actually were staying in the Svyatogorsk Lavra, who like spiritual children of Svyatogorsk elders and Svyatogorsk monks and hieromonks monks. And he said even that one of his chiefs of staff, as the Minister of Defense, was a very notable layman from the Svyatogorsk monastery. He didn't name who it was, but he was probably a member of the one of the Svyatogorsk laity council there, probably one of the church brotherhood there. So essentially, Igor Strelkov's connection to the Lavra and to Russian Orthodoxy in the Donbass is very clear. It's very evidenced, even with his interviews with priests. And there's no real reason to doubt this particular clairvoyant prophecy he received from the Orthodox elder. At least at this point, it doesn't contradict the teachings. If anything, as the prophecy Conrad just read from Saint Lawrence of Chernigov, it kind of just doubles down on the sayings of previous great saints, as well as recent elders such as Elder Zosima of Donbass. So we have this reality, and now that the Kiev caves are going to be taken by the end of March, we're going to wait, several months and see, and may God's will be done, I suppose. That's what we can do as Orthodox Christians. We can pray for God to rid us of this, great tormentor in the face of Zelensky and his criminal government.
No, and you talk about Elder Zosima of Kiev, and he talked about how all thrashings from Kiev will begin, the mother of Russian cities, with the cradle of Holy Russia. And from there it will go all over the Russian land. Russia will not pass. There will be unrest all around, but Russia will stand, and there will be even greater grace. So I think we can hope for things like that. But I know people might call us out for, clickbaiting on our last video about Bakhmut and everything. And for the historical record, we're keeping it. We know it's gonna, happen within the general time frame. But yeah, Ukraine seems to have really doubled down. Zelensky seems to want to even increase the, demonic sacrifice of white Christians at his altar in this front here, which is a real tragedy. And Prigozhin is making more videos. It seems they're getting closer and closer. They're well into Bakhmut itself, but it seems that the Ukrainians are dumping more and more troops in. And I don't know if this means that they've gotten some word from behind the scenes that support is about to dry up, or that there's about to be some big shuffles in leadership. But I'm having a bit of trouble deducing the strategy on their part. But maybe you can help me a little bit.
Yeah, it seems like strategy-wise, Ukraine is simply sending its forces, which are now numbered in the thousands. Prigozhin passed on to us a week ago that the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut have increased by between 10 and 20,000 troops just in the last week and a half, which is an insane amount, especially with new people actually entering the city. There's only one road leading into Bakhmut. This is the western road, which Ukrainians are taking, and they're simply sending troops. And where are they sending them? To the outskirts? No, right into the center, to push back against the Russians, who have a concave sort of position around, bombarding the Ukrainian-held positions with very accurately hitting artillery. And hundreds of Ukrainians are dying. The question is, why exactly are they being sent to this position? Why is Bakhmut not being surrendered by Zelensky? It does seem like a certain ritual sacrifice, perhaps. Maybe it's a way of the Satanists to sort of mock the fact that we're going through Great Lent, or maybe there is a different certain feast days are going on in other more devious traditions and religions around the world, and they're kind of trying to align certain dates and sacrifices to that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but Bakhmut is still standing, and only thanks to the fact that the Ukrainians are throwing hundreds and thousands of more troops into the fray, which isn't a good look neither for them nor for even Western media at the moment, like the Washington Journal, Washington Post, that is, recently said that, well, Ukraine is short of skilled troops and ammunition as losses and pessimism are mounting, but they're still sending more troops to Bakhmut. They're still doubling down. Zelensky and the Minister of Defense of Ukraine actually have said that, no, Bakhmut will not fall, and even though it's not important, we will not let it fall to the Russians. So they're adamant at actually not surrendering it, which frankly goes against all predictions. Even Prigozhin himself said 2 weeks ago that by March, Bakhmut would have fallen, but in fact, it still hasn't fallen yet, and it's still holding. Yevgeny Prigozhin, kudos to him for his bravery, and even, I'm not sure if he's an Orthodox Christian, but he does seem to have faith in the might of the Russian God and Russian weapons and Orthodoxy, and the fact that most of his troops are Orthodox and they're quite strong in their faith, because he's he's actually right on the outskirts of the city. He's not typing and giving these interviews from some cozy apartment in Moscow or from overseas. He's actually right on the outskirts of Bakhmut, releasing videos. He's always wearing a helmet, always wearing Kevlar protection, but he's giving front and center interviews, answering questions, giving updates on the situation of his troops located in Bakhmut. So very commendable for him, at least at this point. He wasn't a very likable character prior to the special military operation in terms of some of his previous actions, and he wasn't the most, him not being an explicit Christian, I guess, and not really being a conservative, a person who supports conservatism in Russia, but just being this outspoken oligarch has not really given him much sympathy amongst, say, the Russian right wing or Russian Orthodox conservatives in Russia. But recently, his duty to the Russian Federation alongside Wagner has increased his reputation to the point where I hope he continues on this path, and it's incredibly commendable what he has been doing, that's for sure. And of course, his bravery shows him just being right there where the conflict is occurring is very noteworthy.
We know he's had his beef with Strelkov, but I think Strelkov coming out and talking about this prophecy at this time actually really, it shows he hasn't been one to talk about future Russian success. He's really just been criticizing the whole strategy and saying that the wrong people are in charge of the operation. But if he's saying that about some 6-month timeline of getting of some major change, I think once it seems that Russia unfortunately has to clear out possibly tens of thousands of young people's lives to take Bakhmut, that will mark a serious demilitarization and demoralization for Ukraine, that we might see some rapid shifts once this is all said and done. Although it seems that Ukraine wants to fight this out for a very extended period of time, which is truly tragic. And we can hope that maybe in the next few days we see a change of heart there. Maybe Xi will whisper some wisdom into whisper some Chinese proverbs, some fortune cookie sayings into Zelensky's ear, and he'll come to see the light there. We can hope, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Naturally, the way the media reacts to the actions ongoing in Bakhmut is very interesting because it really, I think, even you noticed probably, Conrad, in American media, it really has the Ukrainian war has been pushed over the last 12 months as something that Ukraine has been winning and something that Ukraine has been on top of, and only recently has the media recanted certain statements and gone against their own previous proclamations that, hey, Ukraine is actually not doing too well. There's a shortage of this and a shortage of that. And in fact, the city of Bakhmut, even if it does fall, it doesn't mean anything to us, but we're going to commit hundreds of forces anyway. It's very tragic. It's almost as if the media is playing, I mean, by media, I mean the mainstream big media companies, especially in the West, are playing this game of, well, it's simply a story we have to push based on what we're told from abroad and, from these foreign intelligence agencies as well as, domestic agencies. And we don't really have an objective opinion. We won't go report on the ground. We'll just give this already preset opinion on what's happening there, and this this propaganda war, it really is something quite explicit. There could probably be studies and PhDs written on it well into the future, especially how the media shifts and changes its opinions. Notwithstanding, unfortunately, I can't say the same for a lot of Russian liberal media, which claims to be unbiased, because it also, and we're talking about media from people such as Navalny and some of his folks. Their pro-Ukrainian attitudes do not paint an objective journalistic opinion either. They claim that Russia Today and companies such as Tsargrad and TASS and state-sponsored Russian media are perhaps biased and don't portray an accurate picture of what's happening in the Ukraine. But neither do these independent Doge TV, Medusa, Navalny's various YouTube channels. They don't actually give an unbiased opinion either. So no one's really objective here, and I don't think anybody's giving an objective opinion except everyone seems to be giving an opinion coming from a certain perspective, including me and yourself. Like, we do come from a very orthodox perspective, which I think is the right way to go about it.
Oh, I think you'll want to tell us a bit about the Oscars this weekend before we talk a little bit about the a few more things in the church and then wrap things up. But when it comes to Medusa and some of these articles, I remember being in college and we were doing reports on media outlets, and we had to. I was in some journalism class and I had to write a report about like a hero in journalism or something. I think I picked Tom Wolfe or something because I could talk about like the Jewish mafia running like the black racial grievance organization in New York at the time, so I just wanted to talk about that in front of my liberal female class. But this girl wanted to do hers on Masha Gessen and talk about Medusa, and like and Masha Gessen is just this disgusting goblin who like couldn't like hide the fact that she's just an operative propagandist if she tried, and the fact, and I just think it's funny that people eat all that stuff up because it's also just like poorly made. The writing is bad. I've researched all these things, so the Russian fifth column always makes me laugh, especially the ones that like try to that basically exist for like Westerners to read and be like, wow, I can picture some like little girl in Russia secretly reading this, hiding from Putler, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of like it's like a fan fiction for people. But we saw at the Oscars, which I didn't watch. My opinion, of course, the last good Oscars was 2014, which is probably too late for some people, but those are some good movies were nominated that year. But Dimitri, what happened this time?
Yeah, so the film titled Navalny, of course, won the Oscar for the best documentary feature film, and of course the film was about Alexei Navalny, the most prominent liberal center-left Russian oppositionary leader who ran for the presidency, ran for the mayorship of Moscow at one point, was a very prominent corruption investigator as well as liberal politician in the Russian media and in the Russian landscape. Perhaps he's usually called this very enigmatic main oppositionary leader to Putin. Now, the numbers don't really pan out, but online he's incredibly popular. His channels, of course, the algorithm somehow silently assists him in generating millions of views. And of course, this documentary kind of points to the fact that, hey, the Western powers that be, Hollywood itself, the Oscars, they do appreciate this character of Alexei Navalny, who's currently in prison in Russia for breaking civil commercial law and also tax evasion, things of this nature. He hasn't committed treason, so to speak, but Navalny has allegedly circumvented certain Russian civil regulations. So he's actually sitting out his prison sentence, which I think he has about about 4 to 5 years to go, which is a pretty long sentence for a commercial crime, to be frank. Now, Alexei Navalny, one of the great mistakes I think he's made throughout his political career is his kind of disassociation from Christianity and Orthodoxy. Russia, and he understands himself on paper, he's an Orthodox Christian, and he even claims to be a practicing Orthodox Christian, but we never saw him appeal to Christianity or Orthodoxy or anything of this sort in any of his videos, documentaries, or books or articles. He's always talking about liberal values, democratic values, and it's probably similar to liberal oppositionary leaders in countries like Georgia, Belarus, Ukraine. You never see them, despite being Orthodox on paper, you never see them appeal to Orthodoxy. Why? It's because they would push away from all their liberal Western sponsors abroad. And this appears as incredibly disingenuous to Russian viewers who would maybe like the side of Navalny as a certain oppositionary leader in Russia, or perhaps a certain form of accountability to United Russia, but they can't do that because simply he comes off as this anti-Orthodox, this anti-Christian spokesperson. But not anti-Christian for the fact of it, but the fact that he associates with anti-Christian forces does increase this position of him, at least in the eyes of the Russian public, and it's really a bit disgusting. I could compare him perhaps to another prisoner of recent times. You may have heard of Andrew Tate, of course, being held in Romanian prison and being investigated for crimes of human trafficking, things of this nature. Now, Andrew Tate, of course, proclaiming himself to be a Muslim, the first thing he does when he goes to prison, he asks for a Quran to be delivered to his cell, and he walks out of every court hearing holding the Quran in hand, and he gives off this appeal, this image that, hey, he's a very pious Muslim and that he's being oppressed for his religious views. Navalny, even though, yeah, perhaps Andrew Tate is, he's not a Christian, but he at least attempts to kind of use Islam as a certain tool of garnering sympathy. Navalny has never appealed to Orthodoxy, even despite sitting in prison for many years now at this point, and many more years. He's never appealed to the Orthodox Church, and this is really mysterious to me. It's almost as if his sponsors told him explicitly that you may be baptized, you may be a Christian, but you never appeal to Orthodoxy. And his documentary, Navalny, which won the Oscar, does not speak about his Christianity at all, which I think is a huge red flag, and in fact, it took away any sympathy I had for him as a certain person. Of course, I sympathize for his family and such while he's sitting in prison, but that's besides the fact. He's the anti-Christian people he associates with is very suspicious, and it's a huge red flag, I think, in public relations.
Well, I think it just proves that there's fundamentally no like grassroots Christian opposition to like the quote unquote Putin regime. And that's not to say that Putin doesn't do things that sometimes go against the interests of the Orthodox population, but to fundamentally work for regime change in Russia is to be against the Russian people at this point. We know what that would lead to. We know the looting and the chaos and the secularization that would come. So Navalny not embracing that isn't a surprise in the sense that there's fundamentally no market for this revolutionary Christendom here inside of Russia to overthrow, the government and implement, a more liberal democracy or whatever they fundamentally want. But in many ways, we've seen more calls for, as the church in Ukraine gets persecuted, people want perhaps Russia to give the canonical church full autocephaly. But to people saying that, I think that's ridiculous at this point, because the OCU will always exist. It's not like it's not like there won't still be demands for them to go to communion with them. The EP has already sealed that deal, and Epiphany and the people involved are well embedded into the Ukrainian apparatus at this point. They're not just going to go quietly. So appeasement at this point is completely ridiculous. And again, maybe people think this sounds ridiculous or whatever, but the fundamental only conclusion and the only way to really resolve this is for as much territory as possible to be taken away from the current Antichrist regime, so that the people involved in the ecclesial situation can be simplified in that way, so that there's less. It's a complicated thing to deal with jurisdictions and property and territories. That's a way the Russians can kind of just take care of it in a simple way. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, of course, the only way these schismatics, who receive aid, who receive promotion, who receive all kinds of perks from anti-Christian sources from abroad, can be dealt with properly is if the majority of Ukraine is liberated by the Russian Federation from the current oppressors and the people actually in power in Kiev. Now, This includes, of course, assistance to the current canonical Ukrainian church, but also sorting out exactly which churches belong to which particular parish, council. Again, as Conrad mentioned, real estate, which churches are being leased, which churches are being purchased, which monasteries. Because some churches actually are being leased, or at least were purchased by uniates from Orthodox folks during the Soviet Union, and legally speaking, they are. Even though they're Orthodox churches, or at one point they were Orthodox churches, they're now being held, and Catholic worship is being committed in them. Now, all of this needs to be sorted out eventually, and the only way to do that would be under a Russian jurisdiction and on Russian political administration, with the Russian legal code being enforced. Because seemingly under the Ukrainian government, nothing's really been fixed. In fact, things have gotten worse with this uprising of this false Metropolitan Epiphany and his false church. I do agree with Conrad that there is no direct evidence that an autocephaly of the Ukrainian church, and now we're speaking about Metropolitan Onufri's Ukrainian church, with its 45 to 50 bishops, could bring about any sort of benefit to the Ukrainian Orthodox people. In fact, there's no evidence anywhere that autocephaly of any sort, or even more autonomous rights to the Ukrainians, and this, we're talking autonomy away from Russia, away from the Russian Moscow Patriarchate, would improve the state of Orthodox Christians there. Because, as Conrad said, Epiphany is not going to go anywhere. The persecution is not going to suddenly stop. There's no evidence that it will stop, because the persecution is not just being promoted by pro-Ukrainian forces, but by anti-Christian forces from abroad. These people are not interested in simple soul Ukrainianization. Their goals are more far-reaching. They want to divide Russia. They want to go against the idea of Holy Rus, against the idea of Third Rome. They don't want a Russian empire to be re-established in its not imperialistic, but it's in its orthodox sort of form, which holds back evil. And as Apostle Paul speaks about in 2 Thessalonians, they do not want that to occur. What the Rokora spoke about at their council in 1981, they do not want that to return back to the Ukrainian lands. They want Ukraine to be divided from Russia, and that seems to be the overarching goal here. Now, what autonomy or autocephaly gives to the rightful Ukrainian church at this point, I'm not too sure. But at this moment, Zelensky seems to be ignoring Onufri completely. I'm sure you've seen the interviews, Conrad, with essentially Metropolitan Onufri speaking to Poroshenko, to Zelensky, not just interviews, but even photo shoots where he's visiting them and he's telling these Ukrainian presidents, can you guys stop bombarding Donetsk? Can we please find peace? Can we have peace talks? And they simply ignore him. They say, yes, of course, Father, like, don't worry about it, we'll sort it out. And the 8-year conflict, now going on to 9 years, has continued regardless. They do not care about Metropolitan Onufri's opinions. He's simply a pawn in their game against greater orthodoxy.
No, it's a tragedy, and we hope that there's no, we hope that internal issues, once more territory is ultimately taken, are minimal in that regard. But we're probably about to wrap this up here. We want to encourage everybody to check out episode 2 of Ether Hour we put out this week. It's about the czars before St. Nicholas II that have not been canonized yet. Paul I, Nicholas I, Alexander I, Alexander II, Alexander III. And I've always thought, maybe the new czar will be Paul II. All the other firsts got the second. Maybe the new czar will be Paul II, and maybe we'll talk about that in our next episode. But be sure to watch that episode 2, and episode 3 will be coming later this week. Dimitri, if you maybe want to give a bit of a sneak preview as to some of the people we may be talking about, and then we'll wrap things up and do the plugs and wish everyone a good night.
Yes, on episode 3, we'll speak about just the nature of some of the uncanonized saints and their relationships to in the Orthodox relationship to satanic murder of saints, which of course occurs in the case of future Saint Joseph Munoz of South America and Montreal, as well as the Optina monastery saints who were also killed on Easter in the 90s, and some of these other saints, and how these events were perpetrated by the forces were kind of rallied against orthodoxy throughout time, but also explicitly coming out into the forefront in the 1990s. Some of this third episode will discuss these cases in depth, and it will get a bit dark, but it also will kind of show you that the forces of darkness in this world are, even if they martyr our saints, are of course powerless to do anything against greater orthodoxy. Martyrdom is a victory for the church, not something that we really hold as a loss as Orthodox Christians.
Sure, you may have caused some temporary distress in a community or a monastery, but the world gained powerful intercessors before God. So checkmate atheists, libtards, Satanists, pooping and seething. But we are going to talk about that. It'll be our third episode. It'll probably be, I guess, part three and the final part of, I guess, a series that has been not yet canonized saints. So for episode four, maybe expect a bit of a change of direction. But I think it's been a great way to start. I've really been enjoying those episodes.
Yeah, a lot of detailed accounts and a lot of summarizing and succinctly, but giving you guys in a verbal form some of these accounts which perhaps are not well written about or not well known, at least in the Orthodox internet space, which need to be out there because these saints will be canonized in the future, and let them not catch you by surprise, and perhaps you can be some of the first Christians to begin venerating these great people in order for, you know, the church to eventually canonize them. Broad veneration is required and it needs to be organic and natural. That's mainly what these three episodes are about. The future episodes are scheduled to be even more exciting. There are some great ideas me and Conrad have been pushing and reading up on sources, and there's some really good information out there. We, of course, have very broad interests in the geopolitical, orthodox, eschatological fields, as well as relating to history and politics naturally. So there's a lot to speak about. There's plenty enough to go around. If you have any feedback or ideas or things that you'd want to hear about specifically in relation to Orthodoxy, geopolitics, world history, the political sphere, maybe from an Orthodox perspective, do let us know in the comments. We will respond, and we'll perhaps take some of this advice on board, of course.
I want to thank everybody who has signed up for the paid. It means a lot that you would financially support everything we do here. For those that don't know, we've got $7 a month if you want to get access to everything else, all the exclusive content. There will be episodes of Ether Hour that are, of course, public, and then that week we will have a segment of that episode of World War Now will be for the paid subscribers only. You can give us $75 a year, which is a little bit cheaper, I think, in the long term than the $7 a month. But of course, you know, that's all up front. So be prepared on that. We're eventually going to, I think, boost some of the perks for the people that want to give more than even 75. But you know, keep your eyes open for that. And we really want to, again, thank you so much for the support. It really means a lot, and we're going to keep the content coming. Don't you worry. But with all that being said, worldwarnow.substack.com, that's where everything goes down. That's our home base. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel as well, World War Now. Like, share, comment. We love the YouTube comments as well. We like to answer. World War Now, Tele, Tele. Be sure to subscribe there. We're getting close to 1,000. Telegram is one of the best places to share information, so always keep up there. There's always going to be breaking news. And World War Now on Twitter, World War Now _. That's, of course, our fast-growing Twitter page. Follow me on Twitter, GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri, Canonist, Orthodox Canonist. And yeah, with all of that, Dimitri, want to send us off here?
Yeah, just hope all the Orthodox Christians and Christians of other denominations are having a great Lent at the moment. We're somewhat almost halfway through it, but there's still quite a bit to go. So definitely keep your heads down, keep yourselves in prayer. Of those interested in the Orthodox Church, do just, you know, use something like Google your nearest Orthodox church, visit it on a Sunday, speak to the local priest, become interested in that. Of course, follow us on our social medias as well. If you have any questions regarding Orthodoxy, do ask us, but we'll most likely will, in many cases, redirect you to your local parish or your local priest, because Orthodoxy is a religion of practice. It is something you need to go to and attend to in praxis, and not just theory. So it's not just all about reading about the church. You do need to get involved practically. So definitely, you know, stay alert and be very vigilant as well. Keep up with the news, and we'll stay connected.
Yeah, everyone, visit your local church if you can, and God bless.